Now we're going to go into our learning philosophy. So the learning philosophy is trying to describe what are the learning principles and the learning patterns that are at the basis of your learning design. Now, you might be using lots of learning principles. That's okay. I want this to be focused on what are the most essential or the ones that you would call out. Some people, this is a new idea, defining your learning patterns or your learning principles. And so, usually, what I tell people is, with learning principles, what are the things that you really care about? And some people will say, oh, I really care the students have a hands on experience, or I really care that they're building a relationship with their instructors, or I really care that they're trying things out and getting feedback. I said, great, those are the learning principles that should rise to the top of your learning philosophy. And so it's looking across a large database of learning principles that we've collected. And there's more. There's always more. So feel free to add things in here that it might not do, or to have a conversation with the chat, asking it for more information. Maybe there's some you can try and describe what you're trying to do, and it might look in its database and pull out the most relevant. This is really a conversation for you to have with the learning philosophy. So in this case, it's called out inquiry-based learning as being really important to an after-school program on innovation. I would agree on that. It's given some sort of justification why, and it's actually pulled out a reference, and we can look at the bottom to see that Bransford Brown reference, How People Learn. It's a great reference. It pulled that out from the information that's in the database. So most of this information is pretty darn good. If I want to add more detailed, specific references, I can. And then it's given me a handful, in this case 6, that I want to put at the top. So I can always edit this, make this better. Learning patterns is another idea that's similar, but it's pretty new to a lot of people when they're building learning designs. The way I like to think about learning patterns is these repeatable kind of recipes of elements or strategies that, used in a certain sequence, are most likely to exhibit those learning principles and lead to the kinds of outcomes that you care about. So in this case, it's looking at my context analysis, my learner analysis, my skills analysis, and trying to figure out what are the best patterns. So it goes to the database and says, what strategies are most aligned to these principles that we care about? And then what are the patterns that are made up of those strategies? So in this case, it takes the fostering communities of learner patterns, and that usually is made up of a couple of elements. So usually what it will do is it will look at the sequence of elements here. And in first case, the element is collaborative problem solving. Another element is project-based learning. Another one is interdisciplinary elements. Sometimes they're in a sequence that need to be followed. Sometimes they don't need to be. In this case, it gives a little bit of the rationale of what that element is. What are some applications of that aligned strategy? In this case, reflective discussions. What are some personalization options? And what are some evidence that can be collected using XAPI? These will continue to evolve as we make this more useful, but you can kind of see how the elements are being drawn from this database to create a pattern. Here's one for problem-based learning that follows a problem scenario, inquiry-based exploration, and solution development. So if I like those, this is great. If I want to do more, I can say I'd like to add a pattern that looks at collaborative relationships of problem solving between peers, for instance. Maybe you have a set pattern that you use for all of your lessons, where you always start with an introduction. For instance, maybe there's some anchor video. You have a knowledge check to prime prior knowledge, things like that. Maybe you use Gagne's 9 events of instruction. You can always ask it to include that. That's in the database. There's a number of other different types of patterns that you might use as you're building your course. So as you can see, it's going back to the database and it's grabbing different elements. And then let's see, I'll put it down here. That's okay. I can move it. But those all look good. So I'm going to add that. And then I'll just move that where I want. So that's how I use the learning philosophy. It drives how the lessons are built. So your lesson patterns, if your lesson patterns say, oh, we want to end every lesson with a collaborative reflection, put that in your learning philosophy. If you say, I want to make sure that students have lots of opportunity to discuss with other people, put that in your learning philosophy. If you say, I want students to be able to practice and get lots of feedback in realistic scenarios, put that in your learning philosophy. This really becomes the heart of how the rest of the lessons are created, and how learning sciences becomes a major part of how your lessons are created.